Good morning, everyone. Our reading today is Psalms 116. I love the Lord, for he heard my voice. He heard my cry for mercy because he turned his ear to me. I will call on him as long as I live. The cords of death entangled me. The anguish of the grave came over me. I was overcome with distress and sorrow. Then I called on the name of the Lord. Lord, save me. The Lord is gracious and righteous. Our God is full of compassion. The Lord protects the unwary. When I was brought low, he saved me. Return to your rest, my soul, for the Lord has been good to you. For you, Lord, have delivered me from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling, that I may walk before the Lord in the land of the living. I trusted in the Lord when I said, I am greatly afflicted. In my alarm I said, everyone's a liar. When shall I return to the Lord for all his goodness to me? I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants. Truly I am your servant, Lord. I serve you just as my mother did. You have freed me from my chains. I will sacrifice a thank offering to you and call on the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. In the courts of the house of the Lord, in your midst, Jerusalem, praise the Lord. In this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm very aware as I stand here this morning and as I'm about to share what I'm about to share, I'm going to fall short of somebody's theology. I'm going to fall short of what someone in the room believes, maybe many of you. I'm going to fall short of what your experiences are. I'm going to fall short of how you put things together. I'm aware of that. So I come humbly. I come recognising I don't know it all. I come with a pre-homily kind of apology, which is that if I do get it wrong for you, I apologise. I'm more than open to you coming to share with me, because today's homily is one of those really at the heart of life things. How do we put together aspects of the God we know and love and the hardships of life? Life can be really hard. And most of us in the room live with probably a relative sense of comfort. I mean, like physical comfort. But there are people for whom life is really tough, financially. Relationships might be hard. There might be grief, there might be loss. There might be grief for those who have passed. There might be grief for those that you still have to live with, where the relationship has deteriorated. I know people. I'm raising people. I'm not going to tell stories, but I know people, as you do too, for whom these things are true. I've been engaged in ministry long enough and sat across the table or the space from people whose lives are in absolute despair. And I tell you now, the simple answer that God is in control, it'll all work out, are not words of hope. Life can be really tough in relation to health. And I'm aware that that in reading today's psalm, it's about, I'm pretty sure it's about King David, who's come through a near-death experience. And there's plenty of us in the room, and I include myself, who are closer to the end than the start. And I'm very aware. Sometimes I go home from my homilies and think, I don't know if I'm making sense for anybody, because my calls are often for calls of commitment. They're not, like for giving the way we give. And many of you still do in your own kind of ways, and it just amazes me, and I'm so thankful for it. But I'm also aware for many, kind of like when we're closer to the end, it's kind of like, just give me a bit of comfort, give me a bit of peace at this time. And so life has its seasons. Life can be kind of quite difficult, and we pass in and out of seasons. And sometimes we feel like a season becomes a year, and then a year becomes 2 or 3 or 4. And life's really kind of just hits this wane of being a struggle or a churn, as I've sometimes said. Sometimes life becomes hard because of poor decisions that we've made, or that others have made around us. Sometimes without intent, sometimes out of carelessness, sometimes out of recklessness. Sometimes we hit hard times because our bodies kind of hit use by dates, or on particular parts or limbs or joints. Sometimes we hit hard times because our mental health goes on us. Sometimes there are hard events. And I think it's a fair question to ask, because I've heard this question. And it's sometimes a question not seeking an answer because the person asking knows there isn't one. Not a satisfactory one anyway. Where's God in the middle of all of that? Where is God when life is tough and hard? When things that have happened that I really didn't want to happen have happened. Things I wasn't prepared for have happened. Is this making sense to anybody? I hope so, in some way, shape or form. And I don't want to spend today stuck in a place of the God who doesn't deliver. But I just want to dwell there for a moment. Because for many people this is so difficult. There are people who have experienced times when God doesn't protect, or it feels like God hasn't protected. There are times when it feels like God hasn't delivered out of evil, or out of struggle, or out of hardship. When that's really what in our hearts, you're really seeking. And it just doesn't happen the way we hope it might. What happens when God doesn't provide? I've got someone at the moment who's gone from, in one part of her life, used to be homeless, has had housing and job and for quite a while, but her health's just gone on, and she's back to being homeless at age, 51 or something. Maybe sorry if I've got the age wrong, but yeah, when God doesn't provide? Or what about when God doesn't heal? And the other part of all of this is I've met enough people in my time and my life and my ministry to know that the answers to those questions are not consistent. I've met people who would claim God has healed, God has delivered, God has provided. I've met other people who would sit in the mess and just say, God hasn't. The answers are really inconsistent. Do we have to reconcile it? As I say, maybe I'm going to fall short for you today because I'm not really going to try and reconcile all that kind of stuff. I'm just going to name it as honestly as I can to say it's real, and I know it's real. And if you struggle with it, I want you to know that I know. You don't have to be good all the time. You don't have to be chipper. You don't have to be up all the time. You don't have to be joyful with God all the time. The psalm from this morning, as I said before, comes from post-deathbed. Probably King David, the writer of the psalm, had been really ill. And he is not ready for death, it would seem, at this point. And he's delivered from an illness or an injury. I think he's very aware in the psalm that there will come a time when death will overcome him, as it does for all of us. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants. It's a strange kind of phrase, isn't it? I don't know how it worked for you when you read it, but there's this sense in which there is a passing into something that is... God takes delight in faithful servants, perhaps might be the better way of putting it. People who trust in the midst of affliction. But this is a song where David is... it's a song of commitment. It's a song of pledging allegiance. I'm taking my vow and I'm going publicly with the people, to the people, back into the people to lead. And look, the one thing that I guess that I want to say today is well, actually, I don't want to get to the one thing just yet. In the psalm, there are a number of things that David names about the nature of God. So in the midst of his deliverance come these words of God's mercy, God's healing, God's deliverance, God's compassion, God's protection. There's this God's guidance. There's this real sense that God is seeing and hearing the plight of God's servant. And I take it to mean that what David's really naming is that not in spite of, but in the midst of the struggle that he's been through, he's able to see and name God's goodness. I'll say that again. I think what David is naming here in the psalm is that in the midst of that which is really tough, in the midst of that which is really hard, he's been able to see the goodness of God. And what this psalm actually has as a major flavour is gratitude. And I suppose that's my question for you today, that in spite of the mess of life, are you still able to see the mercy, the compassion, the comfort, the love, the goodness of God? And where do you see it? How do you see it? I'm going to give you a moment to dwell in that place, just on your own, in your own thoughts. But that's my question for you. In the midst of your struggles, where have you known or see the mercy, compassion, comfort, love of God? Friends, there are a number of different... You can Google this sort of stuff. I encourage you to go away and do it. Because if the God is in control theology doesn't work for you, and it doesn't work for me, because that raises more questions than it does answers. But there are a number of different ways of putting this stuff together. And the one that you'll know, as soon as I start to say it, you'll know this is me, but the one that makes the most sense to me in terms of my pastoral experience, my pastoral heart, my understanding of people's lives, the way that God works and doesn't work in certain circumstances. The place where I find the most allegiance or the most kind of affinity is this sense, not that God is in control, but that God is all love. And that God chooses to be in our midst, even in the hard times. And maybe the harder work for us when hard times come is to see God in the midst. And I get that it gets hard. I've been as guilty as anybody else of blaming God, of turning on God, of testing God. But I think we're encouraged. This psalm encourages us instead to ask, where is God in the middle of this? Who's been the comforting voice? Who's been the one who's walked with? Who's the person who I don't even know who's praying for me? How was I saved in the midst of a terrible circumstance? How could this have been a whole lot worse if not for the grace of God? Where I want to go just now to finish things up is to say this isn't a foreign concept. It comes to us in the person of Jesus. Jesus takes on human form and identifies, affiliates, has an allegiance with our humanity. Jesus hung on a cross. It's what we remember at Easter time, along with the resurrection. Jesus hung on a cross, discarded, shamed, defeated, broken, suffering. So Jesus knows what it's like for us to feel discarded, to feel abandoned, to feel defeated, broken, shamed, to go through daily suffering. Jesus knows that part of the pathway really well and walks on it with us. So I just want to leave you with two different but familiar with us this morning words of wisdom, of hope. The first is the last two verses of He Hangs a Man Discarded. And Brad had the words right. The words that I picked, the words off the internet, and they were different together in song. So Brad sang them correctly, and I'm going to read them from the version that comes out of Together in Song. And love that freely entered the pit of life's despair can name our hidden darkness and suffer with us there. Christ, in our darkness risen, help all who long for light to hold the hand of promise and walk into the night. And I want to finish with the words of gratitude and hope, which come to us at the start of Psalm 116. I love the Lord, for He heard my voice. He heard my cry for mercy. Because He turned His ear to me, I will call on Him as long as I live. Friends, my hope is that you will know that faithfulness of God, be able to see the goodness of God, and call on the Lord as long as you live.